Proceeding will start shortly. The 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 proceeding will start shortly.
Good afternoon, and I welcome to this meeting of the International Relations and Defence Select Committee in the House of Lords, the Right Honourable Ben Wallace MP, who is Secretary of State for Defence. And indeed, can I say it's really kind of a welcome back, because it's almost exactly 1 year since you joined us for a couple of hours to answer questions on a very wide range of your responsibilities. But today, of course, thank you for joining us as we come to the very last evidence-taking session in our inquiry on defence concepts and capabilities, from aspirations to reality. And Secretary of State, I note, of course, that you're accompanied by 2 senior officials from the MOD. That's Major General David Eastman, who is Assistant Chief of Defence Staff, Capability and Force Design, and also Damien Parmenter, CBE Director General, Delivery and Strategy. Welcome to you too. Now, at this stage, I always remind witnesses and members that the session is broadcast, it's on the record, it's transcribed. And I also remind my colleagues that when they ask their questions, if they have a relevant interest to declare, they should do that straight away. As ever, I will start with what is always rather a wide-ranging question, and I then turn to my colleagues for more focused questions. Throughout, I anticipate that colleagues will wish to follow up with supplementary questions, and given that you've been generous in giving us 2 hours for your time, Secretary of State, I anticipate that once we've reached the end of the formal run of questions, other colleagues who've not had a chance yet to ask questions may wish to come in, and others too, so the questions may range a little more widely than those on the initial paper. So if I can begin the questioning. Of course, as you'll be aware, the inquiry we launched way back in early spring looks again at the impact of the integrated review that was published last year, which covered a wide range: defence, security, foreign policy, development. And that was also accompanied by your own Defence Command paper. What we're doing is to see really how the government estimates it's made progress over that period. And we've been taking evidence from not only officials, but also, of course, very widely about the reaction as to how the government has made progress. So now that we have you in front of us, Secretary of State, can I ask you the same question, which is, can you please provide the committee with an update on the government's progress in delivering on those aspirations set out in those 2 papers? Over to you.
Yes, well, I think, first of all, I think it is important when we set out our Defence Command people recognise this was a 10-year programme. Modernising the army is a long-term plan. It was 15 years out of date compared to its peer group, and modernising all of our capabilities are not something that we can do in a few months. So it is the beginning of a journey, and in many areas we are on track in our equipment programme. Fundamentally, I think some of what we've seen in Ukraine has proved we were on the right track insofar as the identified threat. We identified in both the IR and our command paper that Russia was the acute threat to the United Kingdom, or certainly the main threat, while China was a competitor, both strategically, ideologically, and indeed around the world, that we needed to prepare for and plan for. And I think those two main sort of headlines have not changed. Obviously, we are in the middle of an IR refresh. John Bew, who helped author the original one, Professor John Bew, is going to produce, and obviously contributions from my department and others will be made towards it, hopefully publishing sometime towards the end of this year. But obviously, we are having to take an account of the economic challenges at the moment, and we'll wait to see what the Chancellor's budget produces. I myself will have a meeting with the Chancellor this week around what that means for my department. But I think the progress on some of the highlights, SONAC, the Secretary of State's Net Assessment and Challenge Office, has rolled out. We've appointed a director, and indeed we've already started doing a number of studies, and it's helped really drive some challenge already within the organisation. We have committed to a number of equipment programmes that is important, starting the process of obviously updating Challenger tanks, Challenger 3, obviously the Ajax. I've always promised I'm going to grip it and get on top of the trouble programme. Lord Campbell might laugh. I think you will find we're getting to a better place, and before I get run over by the political bus, I hope that somehow, one way or the other, we have eventually resolved the 2010 programme. That's how long it has been, as one of the big land capabilities. But obviously the investments in all the things that are deeply important to modernising the army are on track. Some of the sticking points still exist in the Air Force with pilot training, which I no doubt you have seen and covered, and we're determined to get to grips with. Then there is a head office reform that I will announce the details of. I was determined to reform the Department of State to make it ready for the 21st century and the challenges and how we do our business, and that will be published imminently in full details. That was my second determination. The reorganisation of the army, such as the creation of the Ranger battalions, has started to develop. We've very early on, it was the Rangers that went to Ukraine within about 2 or 3 weeks before the invasion to train Ukrainians on the NLAWs, which is exactly what we felt was part of their role, which is the ability to help countries help themselves, to build their own resilience, and the further development and selection of them and the investment on them is going in the right direction. But overall, and we now have 2 Batch 2 OPV ships based in the Pacific, one currently in Japan, one heading to Japan, and they have spent the last few months permanently based effectively in the Pacific. So we've started that Pacific tilt that we have talked about.
Thank you, Secretary of State. And can I just take you up on your final comments about the tilt to the Pacific? Because, of course, the Integrated Review, as you said, correctly predicted about a year and ahead just what a threat Russia could be when it then launched, of course, its illegal and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. But certainly the papers in 2021 very much looked at that tilt towards the Pacific. So how has the incidence of a major war in Europe, a change in our spending ability, regardless of the percentage, but the way that the pound has gone, actually our buying facility, how has that affected the approach to having a tilt to the Pacific? And in amongst all that, in the middle, is a vital area, the Middle East, which was barely referenced in the MOD paper and in the integrated review, members of this committee, including me, went to both Bahrain and Qatar recently, and thank you to the MOD for arranging, and the ambassadors particularly, for arranging our visits to the UK bases there. We're certainly very much aware of the importance of the Middle East and wonder why that was kind of just glossed over.
All due respect, I think it was. It's mentioned Saudi Arabia, Gulf Cooperation Council, Oman, Qatar, Iraq, Syria are mentioned in equal balance to Germany, Italy and Greece in this. It is actually here. Our commitments haven't changed. In fact, they may be in some levels have increased. So our standing commitment to mine clearing in the Gulf, which is a permanent commitment, that still exists. In fact, we've gone upwards in the Middle East with a joint squadron with the Qataris that is starting to come online during the World Cup and has the potential to remain, certainly dependent on what the Qatari government wishes to do so. Our investment in Iraq continues at the invitation of the Iraqis, and I have effectively increased the commitment to Oman by demanding that we have at least 2 4-month exercises a year in Oman, in Ras Madraka training area. That compares to pre-IR of about 6 weeks periodic training. So I don't think we have neglected the Middle East at all. In fact, I have a phone call with my Saudi counterpart after this session. So, and for anyone who knows me, Middle East is incredibly important. I think the number of trips I've done to Oman is significant as Defence Secretary and will continue to do so. So we have continued that investment in that space. But what I would say about the Pacific tilt and the questions of, what impact is there on Russia or by Russia's invasion, I think it is inevitable that at one level, insecurity in Europe will make us have to make some new choices potentially. It doesn't change the sort of generic investment and modernization of our armed forces, because ultimately we need, a sort of 21st century capability in our army, which includes deployability. The lessons we're learning in Ukraine are that, unless you are effectively formed with a sort of 360 ability to protect yourself or indeed plug into somebody else, you will be very vulnerable. And the Russians have demonstrated their failures by having lots of numbers. They could boast about how many BMPs and tanks they had, but they had no proper integrated air defence, no proper communications, no proper protective armour on their actual armoured vehicles. That meant the NLAWs and the Javelins just took them apart. And for all of their mass, they couldn't proceed. And those lessons are pertinent to whether we'd use that in the Pacific or whether we'd use that on the European continent. I think what has happened, and will be very welcome for all of us, especially those of us who remember the Cold War, is NATO is going to move to the position of developing regional plans in much more detail. Now, that is scheduled to report sometime about spring next year. And for those of you who remember the Cold War, in the Cold War, we each had our locations assigned. We all knew which part of the German border we deployed to. In fact, it went down to the detail that pilots even knew targets on a sort of D-Day. Now, I don't expect us to have that much granularity, but it means that NATO is going to be very clear in indicating how its overall military plan is constructed and what role we have in it. So I think that will, in some areas, put pressure on NATO partners to have to, what they put forward on their bits of paper about how much availability they have. It will be a very interesting test. It will test us as much as any other ally. So it definitely has gone back to that. So we may find that NATO itself is telling the UK it wants more on the European continent. We'll see. That is obviously up for discussion. General Cavoli is the new Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and he is busy writing and authoring those plans as we speak. But of course, by then, we'll probably have 2 new members, Sweden and Finland, which is an elongated Russian border that we haven't been used to, which will change potentially how Britain sits in NATO, insofar as the High North and its role there, and whether suddenly that becomes our main access rather than the sort of German plains, which was traditional. But we'll see what he does in his plans.
Thank you very much indeed for that tour d'horizon of some of the, well, not some of the most crucial issues that face us today. I next turn to Lord Wood.
Thanks so much for coming today. We appreciate it very much. I wanted to ask you about defence spending. Maybe it's the old special advisor from the Treasury coming out.
Yeah,
obviously, the last Prime Minister's government pledged it would increase defence spending to 3% of GDP by 2030. And obviously, the current Prime Minister and Chancellor are recalibrating expectations of what's happening in the short term. But firstly, I wanted to ask you how confident you are that the government will be able to maintain this commitment to the 3% target. And secondly, what within that scope for possible increase would be the main areas of defence that you would prioritise for increased funding, and why?
Well, first of all, I would say I'm confident that there's a recognition that defence is moving up the funding priority ladder. And I get that also from your party as well when I talk to them. How fixed this new Prime Minister and the Chancellor is going to be on 3%, we'll find out at the budget, where obviously in the OBR you'll have to indicate your spending profiles. From my point of view, what I would say is what matters for me is the next sort of 3 or 4 years. I have my spending envelope that currently finishes in 24, and that was what our previous calculations was based on. So these next 2 years will really be seeking insulation from foreign exchange, for example, and indeed inflation. But if I can manage to get that, then I'm still on track to deliver the Defence Command Paper. Then we have that discussion about actually what does an increase in defence spending look like and to how far it goes. I think what's important is you'll understand this from your time in the Treasury. You can't build a warship in 1 year. You have to get the profiling of your defence spending correct. That's important. So Treasury tricks of upfront big lots of capital to magically spend it in a year won't work. So, if you stay flat till 2029 and then voomf, no one's going to be able to spend, as you know, significant amounts of money. So we're going to have to work very hard to try and get a profile that is manageable of lifting. And I think the big thing here is the culture. It's a really big cultural change for defence spending to increase at whatever level that is. If you really focus on our defence spending going back to 1991, you will see it has been a downward trajectory ever since then, both as a percentage of GDP and really in sort of cash terms. I mean, there's been efficiencies allowed to accrue, but fundamentally, when I deal with my two officials on my left and the right, the institutional culture of expecting every budget to be a cut over 40 years has been a very difficult department to be in sometimes, to get them to understand that we have to think about investment, but to get the wider government to. We've all got used to NHS, Bobbies on the Beat and education. They are 3 big things, and maybe they still are. And that's a debate for a general election, etc. But I'm confident that the argument has been made that defence needs to come back up the priority in investment. The next argument is how much by, and obviously as Defence Secretary I would like by significant amounts, but I also live in the real world. In the next 2 years there is a spending challenge we have to meet. I've got my envelope. Inflation is the biggest enemy of me, with a capital budget that ranges between 15 to 18 billion pounds a year roughly. That level of capital, unlike other departments, means that I am particularly vulnerable to inflation and exchange rate pressures. So I would like to get through that and then plan into the longer term.
By get through that, you mean protect?
Yeah.
Make sure there's at least real flat line, as it were.
Yeah. Or more. I mean, it is obviously, part of the implementing of the Defence Command Paper are some big capital projects, Type 26 frigates, Type 31 frigates. We've got the first of Type 31 being made. Type 26 has sort of completed the first one-ish, and the second Type 26 is on the stocks. Challenger 3 upgrade, Ajax, all of these are big capital programs, big investments that amount to, I think it's 80 billion over the next 10 years. So you can imagine how much that inflation can affect that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next question is from Lord Stirrup, Jock.
Good afternoon. One of the lessons from Ukraine, not a new lesson, but one which we seem to have to keep relearning, is the appalling rate of expenditure of equipment, particularly munitions, in high-intensity conflict. It seems clear that having taken risk on our weapons stockpiles for a great many years, that they were inadequate in the first place. And of course, they're lower now because we've quite rightly given so much to Ukraine. What assessment do you make of the UK's current force structure's ability to fight effectively and enduringly in high-intensity peer-on-peer conflict? Do you think that there are significant implications, not just for restoring weapon stocks, but for increasing them to where they should have been? And are there implications for the types of weapons? Bearing in mind, of course, that in Ukraine, we've only seen a part of the Russian force structure. I mean, Russian submarines, for example, have not actually been to the fore in the Ukraine conflict. There are a great many bits of of Russian military capability that have not been engaged in Ukraine. What sort of lessons do you think will emerge from this?
Some of the lessons are really just about being found out. You very politely talked about taking risks in your ammunition stocks, which I think is polite departmental excuse for we hollowed out our ammunition stocks for 40 years to pay for upfront platforms, to be brutally honest, if you want my view. And this war has exposed that our whole pitch of night one, day one, which was is the mantra of the department and the mantra of NATO, that night one, day one, which might translate as the balloon goes up, you can take out the air defence of your adversary and then at will, effectively pick and choose and do your targeting. What if you don't manage to do that in day one, night one, and it takes 3 weeks, as the Russians found out, their day one, night one, the Ukrainians rather cleverly drove out of their barracks, or rather cleverly used deception in their air defence capabilities. And so, knowing this was going to happen, the Ukrainians, I think, from what we can see, used false trails of where their air defence was. So Russia hit all the wrong places. Suddenly, day one, night one becomes 3 weeks, 4 weeks. You run out of your complex weapons, and you are now where the Russians are. So I think it throws up a number of challenges. One is that hollowing out is finding us out. We're also finding that out in maintenance of our ships and submarines, and I've talked about that before, that we didn't invest in the cranes and the dry docks and all the things that are unglamorous but actually super key for availability of our platforms. I think that's number one. And so one of our priorities is restocking. And what we found in our ammunition stocks is we sort of make the assumption that our highly complex aircraft and our ships are bespoke, and that, of course, when you finish buying them, people don't just hang around with production lines, which we sort of understand. It turns out that even the most basic munitions, that sort of just-in-time supply chain, or that made-to-order, including the NLAWs, finishes when you stop buying them. And sure enough, when you try and reheat the NLAW supply chain, you discover there's a shortage of the optics or the explosives, and you have to start that all over again, and that may take 18 months or whatever. So I think one of the pieces of work we're doing is supply chain security, investing in that. How do we get to a position where that doesn't become a problem so we can have enduring? It's also a question about exports, because one of the reasons our Typhoon capability, if tomorrow morning I wanted to order another 30 Typhoons, we still have a production line because we're still selling around the world. We're selling to just Qataria. I went to hand over some Typhoons to Qatar. It's incredibly good. Their variant is unbelievably good. So all those sort of considerations are coming to the fore, and I think that's part of it. And then on the ability for us to fight in such, in a way, I think that's why I am worried by our land. Absolutely, in the cycle of our three sort of frontline commands, we should worry about the British Army's current capabilities, and that's why the modernization program is so important. 23 billion in the next 10 years. It is deeply, in parts of it, it is way behind its peer group, never mind its adversary. In its physical capabilities, and we need to work on that very much so. And again, you'll know from your own time, the little things matter. The pilot pipeline. I've got more F-35s than I have pilots at the moment. Now, part of that is a first in class. It's a catch-22. You don't have enough instructors to train the pilots, but you don't have enough pilots, therefore, to have grow the instructors. But nevertheless, it's quite a challenge in those things, and that's our pilot pipeline is not in a place I'd like it to be. So we're currently out of sync between the ship, the aircraft carrier's regeneration, and the pilot's regeneration. So we have to fix that. But I think overall, we could do it. Could we do it enduringly? Not with the stocks we have. But we're not alone. I think every NATO member will be in that position.
That, of course, just exacerbates the problem. So could I just focus for a moment on the issue of industrial capacity? You said you can't build a warship in a year, and as you also said, you can't fire up production lines overnight either. So if the industrial capacity isn't there, you don't have the resilience. But the industrial capacity will only be there if the people who are investing in those industries are seeing a return on their investment and the prospect of a return on their investment in the long term. So that, of course, begs the question about the volatility of defence expenditure, particularly on things like munitions. There's got to be some reasonable prospect for industry that the UK and indeed other partner nations are going to continue buying those things over the long term. But of course, as we've seen in terms of managing the defence budget in the short term, all sorts of things happen, like cutting back on orders, all of which bounce back down that industrial chain. So you said there's a lot of work going on in this area. How will you address that particular problem?
So first of all, there's the defence industrial strategy, which I'm happy to bring in Damon Pimenta on that. From my point of view, it goes back to that earlier comment about the culture. The culture that's felt inside the department of 40 years of managing either decline or clinging on is felt by industry. It knows that it is unlikely you're going to have lots and lots and lots of something. And so getting them they've become very good at adapting their supply chain. So, 1 minute they're making anti-air missiles, are quite clever at using those same skills to suddenly do anti-tank, but you can't do it concurrently. And I think that's their challenge. So I think you're right. We need to indicate a 10-year program of defence spending, be very clear about what we want to be sovereign and what we're prepared to do in a different way. And also be really proactive in working with finding international partners, A, for value for money, but B, when we're in the same cycle. The amazing thing about the FCAS, the Tempest program, is we are in exactly the same cycle as both the Japanese and the Italians. And if we can harness their future requirements at the same time as us, and we are prepared to not want everything beautifully bespoke just for us, and they are prepared to that, we can get into a place where we start to build volume. And volume is really key, for the defence industry. And the great thing about the Type 31, the Type 26 frigate campaigns is we've sold the design to the Canadians and the Australians. And the Type 31 is originally Danish, adapted by us, and now I think the Indonesians have bought it. And I recently was with the Poles, who I think have signed a sort of intent on that design. So definitely it's about that conversation, but the underpinning thing is a deep sense that there is a rising budget and we indicate how we're going to spend that. If it's feast and famine, I think we all suffer from that. Damien, you want to say that?
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. And of course, at the same time that we released the Defence Command Paper, the IR, we also had the Defence and Security Industrial Strategy that was aimed very much at these issues about we need to start treating defence industry and actually some of the newer industries as strategic assets in their own right, in the same way that we treat the Army, Navy, Air Force and other things. So by treating it as a strategic capability, you actually start to set out what do you need inside the United Kingdom, what do you need to be sovereign, as the Secretary of State was saying. And then you need to work out how you're going to support it over a sustained period. So it's not feast or famine, and it's not constant competition in a very straightforward value for money sense. Actually, value for money is actually having the weapon systems at the time you need them. And I think that's being proven by what we're seeing in Ukraine, that you do need to have that industrial base that can support you as you go forward. Complex weapons with MBDA is a great example where the department said, actually, we are going to need to sustain this enterprise over decades, and where we've made long-term commitments with the company to ensure that we get those weapon systems on an enduring basis. And DCIS actually allows us to do that across the piece. So you saw the Land Industrial Strategy recently come out that was actually recalibrating how the Army seek their relationships with industrial partners to ensure a stronger portfolio across a long piece of time. So the industry partners, the army, understand what they are getting over that period of time. They get it at the right speed, the right pace, and you've got the people with the skills and expertise across the piece to look at a range of capabilities, not just individual programs, but a portfolio approach. So that's what we're trying to do with DSIS to support that.
Thank you very much. Can I just comment that I've seen a lot of defence industrial strategies over the years, and they've all foundered because the sustained orders were not there in the long term. Thank you very much indeed.
But it does go to one difficult contradiction that you have to balance, which is if you want volume, an armed forces our size will not be able to sustain the volume that some of our competitors have. So the United States volume, when they place orders, they're placing thousands. So what's a few hundred to sell from their production line? So they are always more likely to have a production line whirring somewhere away, whereas many of us don't. So having a consortium with international partners may not mean you make 100% of everything, but it does mean you are probably making volume enough to sustain it. And the Typhoon is the best example of that. MBDA is a consortium of German, French, British and the Italian companies in it. So we're all making missiles for each other often. And if you go to their factory in Britain, you'll find they're making parts for a French missile, or you go to France, you'll see them making parts. And often, as you'll hear from our colleagues in this House, when you get the buy British, it's a slightly lazy phrase just thrown out there. Most things are now made by an international supply chain, not because it's all cheap, but because we have to get the volume. And car manufacturers are no different from ship manufacturers. And when we go to Glasgow and we make the Type 26 and 31, those ships in Glasgow and Fife, they're not 100% British. Right? They just won't be, because I'm also trying to balance what I can find that's best for our people, but also where can we keep the skills up, and how can we, it might be the radar has to come from somewhere else or whatever. And I think that just being honest about that, there's very rarely 100% British made defence equipment, because that also gives us access to their markets. And if you shut yourself off and pull up a drawbridge, the United States couldn't even do that. Remember the F-22 Raptor, the most amazing plane of its era at the time. The United States couldn't afford its total buy, and they weren't allowed to export it to anyone. Hence the reason no one is making it anymore. It's just what happened.
Thank you, Secretary of State. I now turn to Lord Boateng. Paul.
Thank you, Lord Chair. Secretary of State, it's good to see you in your place. Your continuing presence amidst recent changes is a source of some assurance for those of us who care about the defence of the realm. The government announced in the Defence Command paper that it will be reducing the size of the army to 72,500 personnel, down from the previous target of 82,000. What was the strategic logic for this particular figure of 72,500? And will the size of the army be revisited again as the integrated review is updated, and if defence spending increases? And to what extent are headline troop numbers a useful metric at all for judging army capabilities? Likewise, how far do ship and aircraft numbers capture the capabilities of the Navy and the RAF?
Well, so first of all, on the size of the army, we've pushed it back up to 73,000, so we went up an extra 500, which is approximately the size of an infantry battalion or a light role infantry battalion. So in one sense, we have pushed the army back up. It's currently lurking, I think I used the phrase, at about 76, 77,000 in strength. It was 79,000 about 2 months ago. And so we haven't got down there. I've always said as the threat changes, so must the size of everything, or so must what we spend, and I still stick to that. So in my negotiations with the Treasury, I'll be looking at whether we should go down to 73,000 or whether we can maintain it. I think your second point about, is it a good metric? I don't think it's a good metric at all. And it has often been a metric just handed out from the Treasury in number 10 over the years, whereas any other business would seek to be given the challenge of how do you reduce your salary envelope. I mean, that actually should be the challenge to both the Army and the department. If the Treasury has always favoured reducing its RDEL on defence spend. Capital's one thing, but salaries is liabilities, I think, in Treasury speak. And I think the real challenge should have been, and the fairer challenge over the years to the Army is, can you reduce your salary bill rather than how many people you have? Because that's really what the Treasury is really after anyhow. So I have managed an agreement with the Treasury about 6 months ago that we'll push that challenge back to the Army on a salary scale and ask the Army if it can produce a different number based on looking at how it structures itself. I'm pretty struck, and General Eastman will be able to go updated you, that I think the infantry regiment I was part of probably hasn't changed its structure since 1930. I should think it's exactly the same, I would guess, the same number of lieutenants and captains and sergeants and whatever. It'll be interesting to see what the Army comes up with, but I think, in one level, their salvation is in their own hands. If they could come up with a salary package that looks slightly different, they might be able to have more junior ranks and therefore more people. But there's another bit about managing the size of anything, which is, I don't think we've put it in our thought enough, in our contracts when we're buying new equipment, about reducing crews and reflecting autonomy, or indeed reflecting modernisation. So the Future Solid Support Ship, which is due to be announced pretty soon, the current crew of a Future Solid Support Ship, I think, is 115 people, if my memory serves me right. I gave it a challenge of, given the last time we built them was 30 years ago, 25 years ago, could we do it with 10% less crew? Fun enough, you can. Not that hard. And times that by 3 ships, that's 30 less people, 35 less people. The modern 155 artillery pieces that are currently out in the market or being developed, they crew with 2 people. Our 155 AS-90s crew with 5. Now, that's not about a deliberate attempt to reduce the size of the armed forces. That's saying, well, look at modernisation. It then gives you the options of either having twice as many guns for the same number of people, or the same number of guns for half the people. That is a sustainable way to manage the size of the armed forces, based on what are the outcomes you can deliver, rather than a sort of arbitrary finger-in-the-air number, which seems to have always been there. But even within the professional ranks of the armed forces, they all have theories about how big their armed forces are. I didn't make up 72,500 off the top of my head. The advice was, and it didn't come from another service, the advice were some parts of the Army decided that was the size they thought was the right size. Other parts of the Army would disagree.
Yes, well, I mean, Secretary, say, I've got your quote in front of me. As the threat changes, we must change with it, remaining clear-eyed about what capabilities we retire and why we are doing so and how they will be replaced. So I think the question that I have for you is, if we struggled to take and hold a city like Basra with an army of 100,000, bearing in mind what we are learning from the Ukraine, bearing in mind the fact that Russia is deploying surrogates in the Wagner Group in Mali and in the DRC, bearing in mind that China is opening up a base now on the west coast of Africa. So they've got the west coast of Africa and Djibouti. I mean, are you satisfied that retiring 130 Hercules aircraft next year and retiring also 9 Chinook and 120 Puma helicopters, who do what you describe as the unglamorous but super key work of actually deploying those troops, are you satisfied that that is in fact in the best interests of the UK security and defence today?
Well, you sort of answered your own question, Lord Patang. So first of all, we're retiring 14 C-130, and we're retiring 16 Pumas, if my memory serves me right. We're replacing the Pumas with a medium-lift helicopter, and the C-130 is being migrated over to the A400M, a more capable aircraft, which took time to come in. It had teething problems, Lord Stewart will remember the difficulty, but it is now, availability is growing. It's performed unbelievably well in the Afghanistan pitting. So migrating, you always have to retire and replace. That is just the way of things. The key is...
The Hercules?
The Hercules is the C-130Js. There are 14 of them.
Only 14?
Yeah.
Because the original figure given was 130.
No, I think that's that's the 130, C-130.
So
That's
what's happening?
The name of the
happening
Hercules
to them?
is the C-130.
What's happening
They are
to
being
them?
retired.
They are being retired.
And the work that they were doing is being taken up by the A400, which I think we have 22 in total on order, but a potential to grow. That is the Airbus plane that's partly made in, I think it's assembled in Toulouse, but I think part of it's made in the UK. That's an air transport plane.
And knowing all you do now about what's happening in Ukraine, about the deployment of Russian surrogates and the opening up of Chinese bases, you're still satisfied that that's enough?
So if I list the things you've talked about, the Wagner Group preys on vulnerable countries who don't have the resilience to see off both the corruption that they offer and indeed the military capability, which is why the Ranger Battalion and security force assistance is so important. How do you stop Wagner preying on a West African country, help the government of the day be more resilient so that Wagner can't get in there? So that's...
And they're doing a great job. Our people are doing a great job. You've done a great job. But the French are withdrawing from Mali. So
I mean... we can go a different time if you want into the Algeria agreement and the failures of what led to Mali. It's a whole different sort of foreign policy discussion. But I think fundamentally that shows why I wanted to be more forward and present, why 4 months, 8 months a year effectively being in Oman, being in the region. If you're absent from the region and sitting in Tidworth, you're not going to have much effect. Why, on the sort of scale of from war fighting all the way down to very soft power, the defence has a big role in soft power in helping the resilience of those other countries, whether that's Rangers or others. And it has a role by just being there. We have invested more in Kenya. We're doing more exercising there. Very important that we help and support Kenya in its role against Al-Shabaab. We're in Somalia. So I think my point is I am comfortable that we currently have the forces to deliver that and effectively see off some of our adversaries where they would seek to destabilise. The threat, it does change, and I think that is why it's important that we review with this new... I will issue a command paper review based on the new IR sometime in the spring, and also based on whatever the budget is indicating I'm going to get. And I think that is very, very important, as you say. And then the bit about disinvesting and investing is one of the areas that we need to reflect on since Russia. So when we rolled out the command paper, we were very honest that there would be some capability gaps in the middle of the decade that we were prepared to tolerate because the risk or the threat was not as severe as it really is now. So you could take out, you could retire from the army in the middle of the decade its long-range artillery and replace it with its newer artillery, much better range that its peers have. I'm not comfortable with that now because of what Russia poses as a threat, and therefore bringing that forward, even if by a year, helps produce those gaps. So I think threat has the effect of a number of things. One is, do we need more or less funding? Do we look at our scale and our different priorities within defence? And the other one is, where are we vulnerable that we shouldn't be? And ammunition stocks is another example of, if Russia hadn't invaded Ukraine, we probably would have lived with the stocks we had towards the sort of 2028. Now we're not really comfortable with that, and so investing, and we've already started placing orders to replace those stocks.
Thank you, Secretary.
Thank you. And next question comes from Baroness Blackstone. Tessa.
Hello, hi.
Thank you, Harry. My question follows on from Lord Boateng's question in a way. We've had a lot of witnesses at this committee, quite a few of whom characterised the integrated review and the Defence Command paper as taking a bet on innovation, science and technology as against force size. I don't know whether you would accept that characterisation as the best way of delivering military power. And I wonder, if you do accept that, what the rationale behind it was. And perhaps in answering the question, you could tell us a bit about how the government is going to manage the transition between what's called legacy technologies and the development of new ones in order to minimise the gaps in our capabilities.
I'll ask John Leesman to come in on the last question. The force size, the best example is Russia. Right? Russia has put probably nearly all its land forces now into Ukraine. It committed about 65% of its forces, hugely outnumbered the Ukrainians. In open source, it refers to they've lost 7,000 armoured vehicles, 2,000 tanks. Had all the size in the world, but it didn't have the innovation advantage, it didn't have the integration capability, it didn't have the protection, it didn't have the basics for its soldiers in being able to communicate with each other and protect themselves. It didn't have effectively a 360 capability, which goes to this question of, would you rather be medium or small and perfectly formed, or would you be very large and just get flattened on the road to Kiev? So the answer on force size, to some extent, is demonstrated that the Russians took the bet on force size and hollowed out its capability to do other stuff. Then it was add to that very appalling leadership, and you end up with where they were. So I think the second honest answer is our force size has always been generated in the last 50, 60, 70, maybe 100 years through coalitions, right? We're in NATO, that's how we generate our force size. We can debate whether we should be an extra division or an extra brigade, but fundamentally that's still not big enough to unilaterally do what we need to do globally. We have to belong to alliances. That is part of the values we hold, but it's also part of the initiative. I mean, there are only really two countries on Earth that can deploy, well, one really deploy anywhere in the world at massive scale. That's the United States. That the requirement, now we must make sure we design to be integrated. We must make sure we design to talk to each other and play a role in the kill chain, or play a role in the sensor, play a role in the manoeuvre brigade, the manoeuvrability. But fundamentally, I think the last time the British Army was probably of that scale must have been in the 1920s to do it unilaterally. So we seek mass often by alliances, but it's also the challenge is, are we the right size for today's threat? And I think the direction of travel on our defence budget is to increase because, or was to increase, and we'll see what happens in the budget, is because the threat is growing, and so should we. We should reverse that direction. Then the big challenge is, and you'll never please anyone in this challenge, which is the balance of investment. So if we get a lot more money over the next 10 years, do I put more in the Air Force and less in the Army? Or do I put more in the Navy? Or do I put more in submarines and more in surface ships? It's an interesting question that never pleases many people, and is important that we get that in the right place. But unless you can afford mass properly, the question has to be, would you not rather have a perfectly formed, properly defended, capable unit size rather than just a huge number of people that we can play top trumps with? A lot of my colleagues want to play top trumps. What's the point of having hundreds of tanks if you can't protect them?
Thank you, Secretary. So in terms of that transition process and minimising the risk of any potential gaps, there's a number of mechanisms that we're looking at. I mean, the first aspect is that we are constantly looking at force development and force design over time, and that looks over a whole period from now right out to 30 years, and there's a constant force development mechanism that is taking into account innovation and new technologies as they develop, and then we do force variation testing to understand how does that impact, or how might that impact the force design. So that enables us to try and figure out how does that fit into the construct as we're developing over time, and then how can we bring that forward and take advantage of that effect. So that's in terms of future developing capabilities. In terms of reducing that or mitigating against any potential gaps, it's a balance of investment between extending legacy capabilities to meet the in-service dates of incoming new technologies, which is a traditional way of doing it. But we've also combined that with a new novel approach that's being adopted or examined, which is about much more in the way of experimentation, fielding capabilities and then spirally developing those capabilities and then attempting to scale those capabilities that are successful, but being quick to decide when a capability is not going to be successful, removing that from the planning process and then moving on to other areas. That does require us to look again at how we procure. And so there are a number of developing mechanisms that are looking at how we might improve our spiral development processes and our procurement processes.
Thank you very much. It's pretty hard to disagree with your quality over quantity priorities. But I just wonder if I could push you a bit on telling the committee more about what you were describing earlier in terms of cooperation with our NATO allies in relation to the question of innovation, supply chains. Where do we have the comparative advantage? Can you give any examples of projects that we have been developing with any of our NATO allies, particularly in Europe rather than in the US, where you can see the advantages of sharing and dividing labour in a way that produces more effective weaponry?
So our complex weapon, a little stable of weapon systems, Meteor, for example, and Storm Shadow, through the MBDA consortium, effectively, which is that French, German, British, and Italian consortium of companies that create basically, for most, not all, but a lot of our platforms use those weapon systems. That's been a success. I don't know how long it's been in, 15 years? I don't know how old MBDA is. 15 years?
Yeah, I mean, the latest contract's coming up from Europe.
No, I wonder how long it's been in existence. Probably, I don't know, 20 years? I don't know. It's been a success. So some of our brightest people developing weapons systems that have, some of them, significant advantages over the United States systems or different characteristics. That works very well. And the likes of DSTL, our sort of science research organization, will feed in, as will Defence Intelligence, its knowledge of the adversary, as will all the other European nations in there, to make sure that those weapon systems are able to defeat either countermeasures or indeed the adversary. And that's the best example, and I would urge you to have a look at that organisation or company. It's got a significant amount of jobs in the United Kingdom that does that. And that's, you know, as I said earlier, you're finding you're making equipment for other countries and they're making it for you, and it works very well. Another sort of standing consortium would be the Typhoon consortium of Italy, Spain, Britain and Germany. Has made Typhoon fighters. I think off the top of my head, they must be, 600, 500 and something fighters in existence. Fighter aircraft, significant jobs in Lancashire, but also a supply chain right through the United Kingdom for that. So they do work. We are spending 6.6 billion on R&D at the moment, and that is at different levels, and Damien will probably be able to talk about that as well. And going back to my earlier point, that even big United States programs have, you know, British components in it, or British unique systems, and I think we that is because of the investment we've put into R&D. The other bit is the effect on export customers of Britain being the first customer. You know, if the British Army or Air Force are using it, it must be good, is in some extent. People are keen to be part of it. And our investment is in lots of areas. I mean, our latest investments will be around artificial intelligence and quantum and areas like that, but also around, you know, the next generation of FCAS, the Tempest, the next generation of fighter. Will be important for us as well. I mean, Damien, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, thanks, Secretary. I mean, it's a key part of the industrial strategy, and it's a key part of our defence strategy is collaboration, but particularly in science and technology. It's actually given us access to unique capabilities working both with the US, but also our NATO allies and partners. F-35 is a great example of where the contribution the UK was able to make through its science and technology programmes actually got us to be part of that programme. And again, the investment in science and technology both helps you fight today, but most importantly, it's about future conflict. if we don't invest in science and technology, we'll be caught out by other nations that are investing. So you have to keep that constant upgrade, as Secretary of State was outlining. We've got real areas of UK expertise, artificial intelligence, quantum, biosciences, things like that. You know, we are a really influential nation, and therefore other nations come to us and they want to collaborate with us, which gives us that access to wider technologies. Critically for us as well is making sure that that science and technology is properly developed and then put into UK and international equipments at a speed that remains relevant to the sorts of threats we're seeing, and that's a large part of what we're trying to do with the defence industrial strategy. So it's not just a case of exciting science and technology not actually leading anywhere, it's making sure that we tag everything we do so it actually ends up in UK equipment, UK weapon systems, and that of our allies and partners.
We've done this sufficiently well with tanks.
It's an obvious area where we've not done as well. The Challenger 3 is a great example of where we are catching up in that area. I think the comparison with a Leopard tank, is in the public domain to see. The idea of keeping up across the piece is critical. As has already been mentioned, we're part of NATO, so we decide where it's best to invest within an overall alliance structure. I think the most important thing for us at the moment is sensors and lethality across the force structure to actually give you the sorts of advantages you need on the modern day battlefield. And if you look at what the Russians are doing in Ukraine at the moment, they are crying out for those sorts of capabilities. Luckily, we are the ones leading the way there.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question comes from Lord Alton. David.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. And Secretary of State, before we start, thank you. You made a reference just a moment ago in answer to Lady Blackstone's question to the county of Lancashire, and in the northwest of England, which we both know well, you're held in very high regard and respect for the role that you've played in withstanding the invasion of Ukraine by Putin and the illegal war there. Let's stay with Ukraine for a moment, if we may. And you said earlier on that we've learnt lessons as the conflict has continued. How would you characterise the current balance between nuclear, conventional and sub-threshold threats to the United Kingdom, and how prepared is the UK to respond to each type of threat? Some of our witnesses who have appeared before the inquiry have argued that perhaps with the encouragement of Captain Hindsight, the Defence White Paper placed too much emphasis on threshold threats compared to threshold warfare. Would you agree with that assessment? And perhaps building again on the reply that you just gave to Lady Blackstone, we've heard evidence about Ajax, £5.5 billion, with the Public Accounts Committee saying that it had been flawed from the outset. What can we learn from that? And finally, on nuclear capability, we, members of the committee, went to Faslane, were enormously impressed by our submariners, seen what you have had to say about the importance of submarine warfare and our capability in that area. The integrated review announced what was previously a downward trajectory in the UK's own nuclear warhead capability and ceiling. What was the rationale for that?
Okay, thank you, Lord. I thought we went up. In the IR, we declared an increase in our warhead numbers.
Yes. The stockpile ceiling?
Yeah, we increased it. We increased the amount of warheads. It was the... I get the exact for the committee, but it was a thing. So if I go nuclear, conventional and sub-threshold, I think. So on sub-threshold, actually, the United Kingdom is quite ahead of its peer group in many areas. The National Cyber Security Centre that was founded about 4 or 5 years ago has been a real success. It's an arm of GCHQ. It has been incredibly good at building and helping investigate building defences against cyber attacks, and also investigating everything from charities it advises all the way through to major corporations and government. And it's that it manages very secret information and intelligence, and manages to take from that the key warnings and the key countermeasures and communicate it in an open way to a whole load of industries and sectors that it's important, and it's always at the very heart often of our response, and many other countries don't even have that. GCHQ itself and if I think of sub-threshold, often is cyber, can be organised crime, is corruption, political corruption, disinformation being some of the big sort of four in the sub-threshold. I think we're quite strong in the cyber, although it often depends how much the adversary wants to be known they're doing it, so how deniable they want to be or how reckless. And we saw WannaCry, which obviously came out of North Korea, being a completely reckless use of cybercrime. I don't even think the North Koreans were trying to inflict what they did, but that's an example. And so we are ahead in that space. In disinformation, I think we benefit from having a mainstream media. We're not fragmented in the same way other countries are. And I'm a big supporter of the BBC and our mainstream news because ultimately we need a reference point in the storm. And if you go to countries where it's sort of completely all over the place, they are much more vulnerable to a disinformation campaign or a manipulation of the media. And I think we recognise the importance, but we should be on our guard that disinformation and media manipulation is very much a dangerous place that can happen sub-threshold. And I have seen examples of information being selectively leaked by hostile states to media outlets in this country that has then ended up in people using it in a way that obviously the adversary wanted you to, but without their own knowledge, and that is particularly dangerous. In corruption, I've always believed transparency is one of the best ways to protect us in our political culture, and transparency in Parliament is important. And I'm sitting in the House of Lords, so I should say this. I believe that if I was an adversary, where could I target to influence without much of finding out? It would be that the House of Lords doesn't have the same levels of transparency in its interests that the House of Commons does. And I think that does open up some questions about manipulation. And we have seen peers from all parties be a victim of that manipulation. And I think we have to be alert to it. So I think sub-threshold, the United Kingdom is in a good space. It's not 100%, it's never going to be. But I think we're recognised as being quite a strong leader in that space, and the use of things like the National Crime Agency, the National Cyber Security Centre, GCHQ, helping us in that. In the nuclear space, obviously, we don't really have this absurd concept in our doctrine of tactical nuclear weapons that the Russians refer to, and I should remind the committee that a tactical nuclear weapon is, in the Russian mindset, is roughly about 1 kiloton all the way through to 10 times the size of Hiroshima. So I'm not quite sure in anyone's real life that could be considered anything other than a big nuclear weapon. I don't sort of differentiate. I am pleased we have a nuclear deterrent. I am pro-deterrent. I think our deterrent has kept us safe for decades. And right now, with President Putin invoking nuclear one way or the other, whether that is dirty bombs or tactical nuclear weapons or indeed strategic comments, I'm pleased that we sit here with a deterrent that has a quality and capability that hopefully will deter, in my belief, our adversaries. And it's important we continue to invest in it. So the government's investment in Dreadnought, the replacement of Trident, is important, and I spend a lot of time making sure it is on track and on time, because it is really important. But we are, unlike France, for example, the United States, our deterrent is delivered through one method, just the at-sea deterrent. Other countries have 2 or 3 stools, or legs of the stool for their deterrence. So the French have obviously submarine and airborne delivered nuclear. The United States have 3, which is silos, airborne, which gives them their own resilience, as do the Russians. But I think our nuclear capability speaks for itself, and we're determined to be a leader in that with the other P3 countries. The P3, again, not a grouping of countries that are often talked about these days, but are becoming more important. France, Britain, and the United States as the P3. Nuclear powers of NATO are incredibly important, that we work together in upholding the nuclear taboo that has been in existence since 1945. And I think that in conventional forces, I think that's why the Defence Command Paper is determined to try and invest in modernization to keep us ahead of the game. And, you know, I've always been honest that we have not been ahead in quite a lot of areas and we need to play catch up. And that's why the investment is being spent the way it is. And it is vital for the security of the country that we continue that modernisation.
Thank you. My assumption was that there had previously been a downward trajectory, but I think you've given a very good answer as to why that is something that wouldn't be desirable in the present circumstances. I mentioned about Ajax as well, and perhaps you could touch on that. But before you do, let me add one other thing, which is that we've learned in the last 24 hours about another 200 vessels being holed up in the Black Sea as a result of the blockade by Putin, and all the implications for the movement of grain to very poor countries, not least, and in the Horn of Africa, and the narrative which Putin tries to sell that this is all somehow the fault of the West. I mean, what can we do? One of the minesweepers that you referred to earlier on has been moved from the Gulf to the Black Sea. What if that was fired on? What are the implications for us? What are we going to do about that situation?
So we don't have any warships in the Black Sea.
No. We've moved a minesweeper which we've given to the Ukrainians.
There's a two Sandown class minesweepers. They're currently in Portsmouth. I mean, they've been training them on it, but it's up to the Turkish and the Montreux Convention whether they're allowed through. And that was pre-war. I mean, that was a planned thing, but it wasn't. We haven't reduced our offering in the Gulf. We had more. We've replaced other parts of how we do things. So it's not like we're doing less at the moment in the Straits of Hormuz with our minesweepers. So on the grain thing, but so far I think since Russia and Turkey brokered the deal, they've taken out 9 million tons. An annual cycle off Ukraine produces 23 million tons, so everyone's short already. I think this is just an example of Putin using food as a weapon like he's used energy. I mean, it shows to the depth he will go. The worry of destabilization in Africa as a result. I think Yemen, I need to get the statistics the right way, but Yemen and Libya are very dependent on Ukrainian grain. Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the world. I mean, what does that mean? And as you say, the narrative is that it's all our fault. Is not. Now, it's difficult because we can't sell warships into the Black Sea to protect them. The Turkish have been actually very good in brokering the deal, and I will speak to my Turkish colleague. I was in Turkey last week to make sure we try and maintain that going forward. And I think it's important that we communicate with our friends around the world that this is the doing of President Putin. He didn't manage successfully to change that narrative apart to a few countries last time, and I'm hoping that he won't again, but we need to work on that.
During our visit to the Gulf, we heard about the joint exercises between China, Russia and Iran. We were very impressed by the alliances which you referred to earlier on between the United Kingdom and others, but clearly the threat further east to the 23 million people of Taiwan and under the cover of Ukraine. What is your assessment of the dangers there, and what would be the implications for the United Kingdom?
Well, I mean, China, it's in their plan to reunify Taiwan to mainland China. That has been in their plan, whether 50 year or whatever the plan is called. So that is it's not a secret. I think the question for all of us has been that Britain wants a peaceful process towards that. In 1971, I think the United Kingdom, alongside large parts of the international community, recognised the sovereignty of China over mainland China over Taiwan. It was a vote taken in the UN, and I think we took that view alongside many other countries. But the use of violence by a state that currently directly challenges our values of democracy and freedom obviously is something that everyone is working to avoid and discourage. I think what you really have to look at in the Pacific is Taiwan is incredibly important, but the island chain politics is historically the big issue in the Pacific. The politics of the island chain and the disputes around waters and fishing grounds have been hundreds of years. And actually, if you look at what tensions there are between many of these countries, it's around freedom of navigation in the sea, their fishing grounds. And so Taiwan is a problem because if China were to violently invade Taiwan, it would indicate a Chinese determination to break all the international laws about freedom of navigation, the control of the Pacific that is actually not for any one nation to control. And that's why these artificial sort of islands that have popped up, or whatever they're called, are an area of concern, because what follows is an attempt to coerce shipping away from it, or indeed to strike through the international law of the sea, which I think is one of the most ratified UN treaties of all. I think 100 and odd countries have signed it, way more than any other type. So I think that is a concern.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Secretary of State, you refer to the law of the sea, and our previous inquiry was indeed on United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, which led us very neatly into the current inquiry, in fact. I next turn to Baroness Rawlings. Patricia.
Thank you. Secretary of State, thank you very much for coming today at our last evidence session. I'd like to return to the integrated review that highlighted the need to create a culture that supports naturally integration, adaptation and innovation. And several of our witnesses so far have spoken of the need for cultural change in defence, such as improved business engagement and a higher risk of tolerance. What kinds of culture change I'd like to probe further, do you actually foresee and you think are needed in the Ministry of Defence? And what is the government actually doing to generate it? And conversely, does the Ministry of Defence, what do you feel it already does well, but there are areas where further reliance on private suppliers and tolerance for programme risk may be appropriate, in your view?
Well, I'm going to ask David Pimenta to answer some of that, if I may, Baroness Rawlings. I mean, I think from my point of view, it's more of a pan-government culture on defence, which is we've had decades of prime ministers wanting more and chancellors wanting less. We've had defence secretaries finding ways to reheat or indeed repackage efficiencies into spending or cuts into whatever. And we've had some military leadership that I think has always had to try and shoehorn the sort of impossible into something. And that's been difficult for our military as well. So I think culturally it's about transparency and being much more honest. And I was determined with the white paper that I wanted to say, look, I want to produce an armed forces that says what it does on the side of a tin. You know, we've had lots of decades of, I think, distractions. You know, look at this new platform, isn't this brilliant? When all along underneath, we haven't had the stocks, we haven't had the maintenance, we haven't had the key enablers that make it so important. So I think that is a cultural change that I've said earlier is required also across the government. The threat is going up, right? So the threat is going up. There's a war in Europe, and that means that all those sort of historical positions about what is the priorities of a government that we've all got so used to in every general election, and it will be very interesting at the next general election how each of the parties play what they think is a priority, may, in my view, should change. You know, I've been security minister for 3.5 years before this job. I've spent nearly 7 years looking at the threat on a daily basis, and it has grown, and we need to recognise that in how we divide up the public spending cake. On the other parts to your question, I shall ask Damien to answer.
Thank you, Secretary of State. So there's an awful lot going on culture inside the Ministry of Defence. You asked about what we do really well, and I looked to our colleagues in uniform, and they are absolutely incredible. I had the pleasure of being at the Royal Marines' birthday dinner the other night, and there is a group of people who are actually at the cutting edge of military thought, outstanding individuals, envy of the world. They bring thought leadership, innovation to everything in military affairs because of their desire to win. And ultimately, that's what we are good at in defence. It's that desire to win when given an operational context, a real mission to get after. And we must never forget that. That's the rationale for being here, and we're very good in the armed forces at doing that. But there's lots to get after in the defence culture sense. And I think it starts with the idea of the integrated review. That is about integration, as the Secretary of State says. It's not just about inside defence, it's with the rest of government. It's all the levers of power. And I think one of the things to emphasise is economics. You've seen the power of sanctions in the Ukraine conflict. Really important that actually we factor into the overall response to Ukraine, and how we think about that collectively in an integrated way with other activity in government's really important. You then get to, if I talk about what's happening inside defence, making sure that we are integrated. So it's not about 3 individual services, a strategic command, D&S and a head office. It's actually about how do we have one defence mindset, that every single part of defence gets after the things that are really important to the nation. So actually, first and foremost, you understand the defence strategy. What is it we are trying to achieve in the world? How are we going to achieve that? How do we collaborate together to ensure that we are all delivering across defence to achieve those outcomes? And again, Ukraine has been a fantastic example of how defence comes together with a very clear mission to get after it across all our levers, whether that's working with industry, working with allies and partners in NATO, or actually getting on and doing things with the armed forces. The support we've shown to Estonia and other nations, hugely important. So I think the cultural change of one defence mindset is crucial to ensuring that we become properly integrated and we deliver more than the current sum of our parts. Empowerment is another big area of activity that we're getting after, making sure that we move beyond the hierarchical. One of the real strengths of the armed forces on a battlefield is having a clear hierarchy, being able to get after decisive action on the battlefield. Actually, what we need to do inside defence, particularly in the business space, but also as we think about innovation, making best use of science and technology, is empower everybody to come up with the ideas and the solutions that we need. Because I'm fairly confident that many people my age in defence and slightly younger probably don't have all the answers when it comes to being tech savvy and innovation. Actually, our younger folk are much better at it, and they'll bring ideas to us that we couldn't imagine. So we've really got to empower everybody. So I think that's one of the key things we're doing. Diversity and inclusion, hugely important. We make sure we're not all clones of each other. It's so important to make sure that you've got a diverse workforce that recognises opportunity, actually brings in ideas that you wouldn't necessarily spot if you all came from a similar background, one of the great lessons from Chilcot. So again, making sure we have that diversity and inclusion across the department. And I think finally it's making sure that everyone upholds the really strong values and behaviours that the Secretary of State and everyone else expects of our armed forces. And I think we're taking action to ensure that people are held to account and if necessary dismissed in some of the cases we've seen recently.
Lovely. Thank you very much. You've explained very, very clearly, but what I would like to ask you and probe a bit further about examples of improved business engagement and risk tolerance, which you haven't really answered, which if I...
Indeed. So again, returning to an area I know, the industrial strategy. So yes. The relationship I've had with industry over the last couple of years has been about very frank discussions, understanding where each other is coming from, understanding how working together we can actually be better. So rather than just looking at industry as a series of competitions where I want to get the cheapest aircraft or the cheapest missile, actually moving away from that about partnership to actually change that business relationship and partly bringing in business expertise into the department. So one of my defence, my DG colleagues, Director General colleagues, has just come into the department from industry, bringing with her all the experience of working with industry. So we have that insider knowledge and that makes us better as an organisation. A lot of our parts of the organisation are working very closely on innovation, working with new SMEs, new smaller medium enterprises to actually understand the art of the possible. So again, that's where we are working in a more business savvy sense. There's a whole range of reforms taking place in project management in D&S, our procurement agency, to actually make sure that everyone is properly upskilled to be more business savvy, to actually understand project management. So there's a major change transformation going on there. And again, that gets to some of the risk taking, actually understanding what is a responsible risk to take. From my perspective, I'm sure from the Secretary of State's perspective, a bigger risk is to be stuck in very slow programs that aren't going anywhere or take a number of years to deliver. Actually running with a slightly riskier innovative program up front and maybe being able to accept that it's not quite worked, and then moving on to something else is better than running with a program that takes 7 years, particularly when we've got technological advances coming at it at a rate of knots.
So
Lovely.
we do have, if I may, we do have actually some rapid acceleration sort of interfaces with small and medium-sized businesses deliberately for innovation. So the Navy has something called Navy X, which is about rapidly bringing capability into the Royal Navy. There's quite a lot of risk in there. There's a lot of experimentation. Each service, I was just trying to ask what the name of the Army's version of that is. It's very, very important. And we've been using some of those lessons in how we supply Ukraine. It is stark contrast about, it seems that when I buy stuff for Ukraine, I manage to be able to do it in days and very few weeks, but when I want to buy a similar thing for myself, it can take months and months or years. Remarkable in that. So we are, again, learning, but we're also taking risk. We sometimes buy things that promise amazing things for Ukraine. When we get to test them, turns out they don't, or some of them do. So we have these accelerators. There's the Defence and Security Accelerator, which is very important at that interface. And of course, they mainly play to the medium-sized or small businesses rather than the big primes, which are obviously locked into some big programs for us. So I think you'll see more of that, not less. And we now have an experimental battalion in the Army where we can adapt pretty quickly things, and we try it out through this battalion, and then the next decision is for the Army to decide whether they want to adopt that fully into its Army. And the best example I can use is the Brimstone missile, which was originally designed as a helicopter missile, but has been most recently carried on our Reaper drones, and I'm not sure if it's on Typhoon, but certainly a very, very capable weapon system. We have gifted some of those to Ukraine. When we were doing that, it transpired to us that actually, why don't we look at using them in a similar way to the Ukrainians might use them? So we've found effectively a vehicle. We've mounted them on a land vehicle, a vehicle that can fire it from itself, which suddenly gives the Army a 12-kilometre range approximately, very smart missile capability. And we're generating that. It's been put together with MBDNA, with CAT, and it'll be in the experimental battalion in a couple of months. Now, I suspect if I had a blank sheet of paper and designed it from scratch, my successor would come along and talk to you about it, but we managed to do it in about 3 months. So we are definitely getting there. I often find the big question, and it's gone on for years, is then asking the frontline services if they have a requirement. We have a lot of experimentation that then goes nowhere. And that's the challenge. It goes nowhere because when you turn around and you say, okay, so how many do you want of them? The Army, Navy or Air Force go, we don't really know yet. And sometimes that they get lost or nothing happens. So I think what I've tried to do with our R&D is envisage that if this is successful, we will at the end of it buy some and pull it through, and that's how you then get traction for exports and everything else.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary of State. And we now reach the last in our formal round of questions. That's going to be from Baroness Fall. But can I just remind colleagues that there are questions they can put beyond that. I've already had indications from Lord Anderson, Lord Campbell and Lord Stirrup. They'd like to ask questions, but I should be looking around to see if anybody else wishes to as well. Kate.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary of State, and thank you for all you've done fighting Putin over the last period. And to that, I just wanted, in this final question of the formal round, to come back to the question of our support to Ukraine and where you see that going in the future, and how you see our contribution in and against the sort of NATO work as well. Midterms coming up next week. Curious as to whether you think that's going to have any sort of effect on the American commitment in terms of NATO, defence spending, that sort of thing as well. And to a point you said to one of my colleagues earlier, of course Putin's fighting this war in lots of different ways. You mentioned grain, energy, but also we saw, the pipeline blown up no one knows exactly who did that. But again, that sort of sidelining, what can we do about that? Thank you.
So thank you. On Ukraine, look, I think if you stop the clock now, Putin is losing. I mean, Ukraine maintains the momentum. It is continually to take land back from Russia occupation. It is inflicting significant harm on the Russian army and air force. And so the direction of travel is that I think it is likely that by the end of this month, the northern part of Kherson will be depleted of Russians, or the Russians will have left that part, which brings into range parts of Crimea from long-range artillery that the Ukrainians held, or the HIMARS type systems. And in the east, Ukraine made significant advances a few weeks ago, and they continue to push and press on the Russian forces who are suffering poor resupply, running out of complex weapons significantly, and very low morale, desertions, people being mobilized and within days being sent to the front line, many of whom are dying, no food, no socks, no basic equipment, rusty guns. I mean, it is in a sense criminal that their generals have sent them to war that way. So the momentum is with Ukraine. We have always said that we wish to support and help Ukraine to defend their sovereign nation, and that Putin should fail in Ukraine, and that it is for Ukraine to decide from a position of strength when it wishes to negotiate or what it wishes to negotiate. And I think that is important, that it is Ukraine's choice, it's not ours. We shouldn't be pulling strings on Ukraine, and they are in a current position of strength. How far they wish to push that is entirely up to them, and we will stand by them, as does the international community. The future, obviously, we have the winter coming up. I don't actually expect the Ukrainians to stop in the winter. I mean, we all sort of say, well, it's winter and everyone's going to stop. These are hardy soldiers, and both the Russians and the Ukrainians, that is their part of the world, and I don't think they'll just stop. They'll continue to press. And of course, the Ukrainians are now better equipped than the Russians in many areas. So I think the war will go on. The question then becomes how much, the race for resupply, and the international community through the International Donor Coordination Cell, which is international, Britain, United States, Canada, lots of other countries there. The EU are still in the business of finding supplies, either to gift in kind from ourselves, or indeed we're getting to a position now where we will be placing orders in production lines for Ukraine from around the world to make sure they can continue in their resupply and indeed hold their equipment levels to the right thing. But Russia will be doing the same. Russia will be out combing the world, trying to find donations, well, not donations, but trying to buy capability to see itself through to the spring, because President Putin's ambition, obviously, to occupy the whole of Ukraine hasn't depleted. It's just spectacularly unsuccessful, but that hasn't gone away, and no doubt he will continue to push his pushes people into continued offensives that at the moment fail. So he'll be looking to resupply. One of the challenges for him is a lot of his component parts seem to have come from the West. That is going to be a challenge to the refurbishment of the Russian army, which could take decades if he cannot get hold of that equipment. It's why he's resorted to Iran and buying these drones. And, there are echoes of the V-1 rockets, firing these drones in their significant numbers into civilian areas of Ukraine, into the critical infrastructure. So we have to help Ukraine defend themselves from these indiscriminate Iranian drones. We have to help Ukraine continue with its momentum and remain strong, but we also have to make sure that Russia understands that that the international community is not buckling, it's not fragmenting, it doesn't agree with what it is doing. China has abstained. It's quite interesting. All the way through this, China, which Russia would, I think, take for granted as a friend, has not voted with it in the UN, has not supplied military aid to it, and has effectively sat back. And I think the only thing China has done is successfully realise it can probably buy gas at a discount, as have India. And I think therein lies Russia's challenge. That it is, if you look at the people who do vote with them at the UN, it's hardly a cast of the friends you'd like to have around your house. So I think that is the direction of travel. And as long as we all stay together, that's good. I'm not going to speculate on United States elections. I think it's probably even more unpredictable than the United Kingdom these days. So, but look, I was in Washington 2 weeks ago. They're all completely in the same position of supporting Ukraine. And if you look at their foreign international aid, it dwarfs us. I do think we need to turn our mind to international aid for rebuilding the country, because actually, when Ukraine makes its decision, the president of that country will need to tell his people that he has the resource and the assistance to rebuild that country, which ultimately, in my view, is the real message you send to Russia, is that an open liberal democracy that engages and respects the rights of individuals gets to look like this, you get to look like that. And I think that is a really important message for them all. And so we have to think about a Marshall Plan or something in the international community to help rebuild Ukraine.
Thank you very much. And with that in mind, I mean, you mentioned before that of course that Putin used as a narrative one of the reasons for the invasion, the expansion of NATO. Many people think it had more to do with Ukraine turning towards the European Union. But as a result, we have these applications from Finland and Sweden. You mentioned this in your earlier remarks. What do you see in terms of the future for that application and the huge sort of new border and large army that would bring?
Well, I think NATO didn't go recruiting, which I think is the narrative that Putin always liked. I was in Finland last February or this February, and had been there in the sort of December, and I'd met the president and the foreign minister, and no one was talking about joining NATO. And in fact, I think none of us really thought that Finland and Sweden would join NATO, which is why we developed a security pact with Finland and Sweden. Britain did, because I always felt it would be inconceivable that we wouldn't come to the assistance of Sweden, for example, if it got invaded by Russia one day. So that's why we did it. We didn't think they'd go to NATO. But it shows what blundering Putin has had in his strategic concepts, that you threaten someone, fun enough, you often push them the wrong way, as he would see it, and they joined. So they're incredibly capable armed forces. We have a lot to learn from them in some areas. They're very, very important to protecting the sort of North Atlantic and that sort of region. Putin has now set up a choke point coming out of the Baltic, where you've now got Sweden and Denmark on that strait, both NATO countries, which is a real strategic dilemma for Russia in the future. They're very professional armed forces. They're not saying what we want is thousands of British troops, but they do want to exercise and train together. And we'd already started that process through the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is the 10 Nordic nations and Scandinavians, including Iceland, and Holland, and we'd already done a good few years of training together, even when Sweden and Finland were obviously not in that patch. So I'm meeting them all next week in Edinburgh. The JEF ministers will assemble. It was going to be in Denmark, but they've had an election, so we're going to host them in Edinburgh. We had them in February this year up in Leicestershire. So overall, I think for Britain, it puts us in a really good geographic sort of cockpit with like-minded nations, and it can only strengthen NATO's capability, not weaken it, and gives a new dilemma to Russia that now he's got a very long border with NATO, something he always was terrified of. He's now delivered entirely through his own actions. I think the key for the Russians to understand is it is entirely his actions that have delivered this. No one else has done it. He's done it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have indications from 5 members. That's Anderson, Campbell, Stirrup, Alton, Boateng, and we have got 27 minutes, so we'll try and squeeze that in, if we may, with your assistance, Secretary of State. So, Lord
Secretary of State, in reply to Lady Blackstone, you've already touched on the dynamic relationship between unilateral contributions and those from our alliance, particularly, of course, NATO, where we were founding fathers and have contributed massively over the years. How do you see, in the light of Ukraine and generally, our relationship with NATO evolving? You've mentioned, of course, Finland, Sweden, a massive miscalculation, as you've said, by Putin, and they will be major contributors. Do you see within NATO a greater specialization? Do you see us, for example, continuing to seek excellence across the spectrum, or will now we be more ready to, if not to subcontract, at least to release some of our energies to other leading allies or groups of allies?
Well, I think the first question for NATO is NATO has sort of woken up,
yes.
And it is I started my military career in West Germany, or Germany as it was, in near Hanover. So it's quite interesting that people are blowing the dust off. Mind you, they are in our own department as well. All those things that we used to think about, and I think the question for NATO is how is it going to get its members to play to its strength? Now, are we all going to have generic contributions, or are we going to say, look, this is what we think we can do? When I saw General Cavoli last week, he said, you would say that. They all say that. They all want to, ask us to accept exactly what you've already got on the shelf. So I think the question for NATO will be, how do you defend Europe from Russia, and what part we all have to play in it? And I think that's quite important for it. Obviously, I would say, well, look, we're very good at this, and, isn't it for this country or that country to do that part of it? And I think that'll be the negotiations that we all have as the plans come out. But fundamentally, we will all have to invest, and I think 17 countries of NATO have increased their defence budget since the invasion. And that's quite telling. The Poles are going to go over to 3%. The French, I think last week, are pledging to increase by 26% their defence budget. So that challenge about the cultural change is real, and Britain shouldn't think it should be exempt from that. But we'll have to see how the plans fight a 21st century rather than a 20th century war. That's going to be interesting.
Thank you. I'm turning next to Lord Campbell Ming, but also I will go back to Lord Anderson if there is time. Ming.
I'm genuinely pleased to hear what you say about progress in relation to Ajax. Warrior could not go on forever. And I'll make an offer to you. As soon as Ajax is ready, if you invite me to come and have a ride in one, I'll accept it. But the question I wanted to ask you about was something that we've had in evidence, and which I've no doubt was fastened on by those who've been helping you prepare for this event. And that is, we've had evidence that the armoured division, fully manned, fully equipped, which the Americans expect of us, is not available and might not be available for some time. But we can't overemphasize the importance of our relationship with the United States for all manner of reasons. How soon do you think we would be able to fulfill that commitment?
Well, we haven't had an armoured division that could really deploy since 1991. Even when we went to the first Gulf War, we did not deploy a full armoured division. We had 2 armoured brigades, and I think the third one was a commando brigade or a light brigade. It was an air assault brigade. So my point about, for many decades, we haven't really delivered what we said on the tin has been an issue. And if I look at the current armoured division we have on paper, it's lacking in all sorts of areas. It's lacking in deep fires, it's lacking in medium-range air defence, it's lacking in some of its electronic warfare and its signals intelligence capability. It's lacking in some of its modern digital capability, shooter to sensor. On top of that, it's probably lacking in weapon stocks. So, I'm not sitting here pretending I can waffle away and pretend it's fine. I don't think it is fine. But in exchange for my honesty to people like the United States and America and NATO, I need to see how we're going to fight a modern war necessarily, and whether a modern armoured division looks like the division I was in. And that isn't me trying to get out of commitments. It's like, what is essential for a modern armoured division? And I think the other point is, a lot of our air defence is delivered by aircraft in our system. It's less so in other organisations. So, we would say that our long-range air defence is delivered by the Royal Air Force, not by, ground-based, big, long. The Russians have the S-400s and the S-300s, and the United States have Patriots. We don't do that. That's, well, historically isn't how we've done it, but things are changing. And look, if you look at the damage that HIMARS has inflicted on the Russian army, those are weapon systems with about a 70 to 80 kilometre range. And as long as you can get the ISR in place, which is the real key, I think, of lethality these days, which is, can you find someone or can you hide? If you can be found, the proliferation of precision is such that you are very vulnerable. And so I think what I would say in exchange is, does a modern armoured division have more longer range artillery and less tanks? Does it have more tanks with missiles accompanying it? Does it have more air defence? Because at the moment we are all very vulnerable to drones. I mean, really basic drones, where people are firing very expensive missiles at drones that cost a few $100s. So I think my exchange would be, yes, we are lacking in lots of places, and we've been carrying that myth for decades, if you want my honest opinion. But in exchange for that and the 23 billion pounds of investment to get back to a well-formed land capability, I'd like to see some doctrine and a modernisation of how we're going to fight.
And is that something that's actively under consideration, a different doctrine to reflect the different components of conflict?
So the reason SONAC was so important, this Secretary of State's net assessment and challenge function, is to import to some extent what the United States do, which is wargaming and testing in a way to really exploit and understand our vulnerabilities. And we've already started stepping up our wargaming capability, which the Americans are far better at wholeheartedly incorporating into their structure and their modernization of their doctrines as they go. We have not been, I think, as systematic in that space. We've set up a wargaming school at Shrivenham, but the key is to get it into the whole of the frontline services and change how they think. And I think that's why that is quite important. And we've already seen that in Ukraine, and as we look at what happens to Russia next, wargaming will play a central role in that for us. I don't know if General Eastman wants to contribute.
I think the other aspect of this is to think about effects that we're trying to achieve rather than thinking about specific capabilities and specific units of action. Okay. So, the whole point, I think, now, in terms of modern warfare, is it's about us being as integrated as possible and having as much connection between the sensors and understanding of what's going on and those that can have an effect as you can. So it's bringing all of the domains together. So we need to think about our capabilities in a slightly different way and try and get away from some of the old terminology that we've been using, I think.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Lord Stirrup, John.
I'd be grateful for your response to two questions which I think lie at the heart of this inquiry. The first is about prioritisation. The independent review in the Defence Command paper had long lists of challenges and aspirations, but were less clear about priorities. Now, you could argue that that's appropriate because priorities can change with changing circumstances, but it gave rise to the impression that our ambitions were outstripping our likely capabilities and resources. Would you agree that in the light of the review's identification of Russia as the acute threat and the experiences of the past year, that For the UK, in defence terms, the main effort remains the defence and security of Europe, and that the Indo-Pacific tilt is more of a diplomatic, economic, technological endeavour, which is not to say that there's no military involvement, but the very word tilt gave the impression that we were tilting away from Europe, and that clearly doesn't seem appropriate at the moment. The second question is on the so-called bet on technology to provide us with an operational edge and to act as a force multiplier. That gives rise to two questions. The first is that right in principle? And you and others have given us some very powerful evidence in support of that. But the second is it deliverable in practice? And in this country, we have a very good track record of having good ideas, but we have a very poor track record of turning them into commercial successes, which, as we agreed earlier, is necessary if you are going to translate that through into capability in the field. Does that require a whole new culture and model of engagement with industry and the financing of these projects? And if so, would that survive first contact with the Treasury?
Yeah. Well, I'm still there, but we've had a few chancellors, so maybe who knows? To be fair, I don't really like the term a bet. I don't think we're betting. What we don't have is the luxury of trying in one part of our armed forces and holding on to old in case it doesn't work. And if you look at the United States, they can do that. They can take whole brigades and invest them in doing something differently. And effectively there is a risk there because what if it doesn't work, or that's one of their brigades they need to do their day job, and so we do sometimes have to take a leap. I wouldn't say leap is faith. I wouldn't say that. So, but we definitely have to, take a judgment, take a call that there is a downside, which is, if we continue to invest in Boxer and the modularity, a fantastic piece of equipment, and we grow from, I think our current target is 750, but we may, if we bought lots of different variants for mortars and 155s, if that was our choice, and I haven't said it is going to be our choice, it go up to 1,000 plus. That's wheeled, right? So that is giving up the Warrior, but going into wheeled. And there is we don't have that capability just to buy a whole load of both. And so I think there is always going to be for us in Britain that challenge, and we just can't do. And there is a risk, and that's just the honesty of it. I think you're right about the tilt. I used to come here and other committees and say, look, the Pacific tilt is as much about culture and science and imaging. The defence was actually the lower off the tilt. I think it's driven by the recognition of the biggest growth in GDP in the world in the next 20 odd years is in the Pacific, and we need to be there. We need to be there with our businesses, with our culture, with our science and our innovation and our education, and we need to be part of that. And alongside that comes obviously defence. But I don't think it's either or, and I think our white paper said the cornerstone of our security is NATO and Europe, and I think that will remain so. And I think the question is really in the United States is, are we here to backfill if you choose to withdraw or do less in Europe? Is it for Britain, France, and the other big military powers, and Italy in Europe to effectively step up to that plate? Or do you want us to go with you to some extent? And I think we haven't yet had that strategic direction from the United States. And I think the point about different presidents, it's not necessarily in a position of a long-term predictability. I couldn't predict what America will indicate in the next, depending on who's the next president, let's say. So I think that's right. But fundamentally, we are key partners in NATO. It is our duty, our home beat is the North Atlantic. It shall remain so. Of course, we'll want to invest in the Pacific. We'll also want to design our forces so that if we do go to the Pacific, they are interoperable with Australia and the United States, which is why AUKUS is so important in the submarine capabilities. And I'm confident that part of our force could do that. We've just had some typhoons in Australia practicing. So the key is options, but ultimately, taking a lead in NATO being one of the key framework countries in NATO is our home beat and is our day job.
But the question of an innovative financial model with industry to match the innovation in science and technology.
Yes, but I mean, I've heard this for years. I mean, a bit like, I used to work in Kinetic, right, for a few years. Ultimately, it requires a customer to indicate they want to buy it. So I remember the UCAV, which is an extraordinary capability, developed an unmanned combat air vehicle called Tyrannus, I think it was its name. The MOD funded it in 2000 to 2006 or something. I remember it being wheeled out, quite a remarkable piece of kit, made with British industry in stealth. There was a launch, you weren't really allowed to touch it, you could take a photograph of it, sort of thing. And then nothing happened, because the Air Force didn't say, actually, we should have that. We want, that's fine, I understand, but unless you really are ultimately lead into a requirement, industry will only go so far with you. So I think one of our real challenges is to decide what we want, indicate that's the direction of travel, and on the balance of investments, that's our priority, and then make it as easy as possible for industry to come with you, but also that one company doesn't shut out all the others. The dominance of the primes, they take the risk, they would say, but they can be very selective about who they choose to bring with you. And I think that is the real direction. So I think I would love a long-term budget that goes beyond me, beyond my successors, beyond our governments, and then we can make those decisions. But in UAVs, we're still there. I don't know how many autonomous projects are across the three services. I mean, they'll be in the double figures, I suspect. Instead of someone saying, stop, let's just put it in one place.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I hope we have time for Lord Alton and Lord Boating. David.
Thank you, Lord Chair. Can I take you back to the answer you gave to Baroness Fall earlier on about the rebuilding of Ukraine, the enormity of what has happened there? And you said there needed to be a new Marshall Aid programme, and I think we would all agree with you. Given that some $300 billion of assets have been frozen, why can't we confiscate those assets and use those and utilise them for the rebuilding and the equipping of Ukraine in the months and years that lie ahead? And in terms of holding people to account, Putin in particular, you'll have seen the New Line Centre and the Raoul Wallenberg Centre's recent report on the potential for a case of genocide to be brought against Putin for his pronounced aim of eradicating Ukrainian identity and people. But even if that isn't provable, the Geneva Convention guards against the targeting of civilian populations, and we've seen mass graves at Mariupol, at Bucha and elsewhere. What are we doing to ensure that there is proper accountability for these terrible crimes against humanity?
So on that point, and we've been assisting the ICC in evidence collecting, as have the Canadians, and I think wherever we can, and one of our Attorney General, previous Attorney General, I think now the Home Secretary, she visited Lviv a few months ago with I think members of the ICC, or certainly to visit the Ukrainian Attorney General. And I think we're in the process of collecting evidence alongside many of our international partners, and we'll do anything we can to support the ICC. I think you tempt me on the sanctions effectively out with my brief. I don't know the legality of how you confiscate to spend sanctions, and I would urge you to write to the Treasury, who I think is the lead department on sanctions. But look, there is a price that Russia should pay for what it has done to Ukraine. And how that price is extracted, I'll leave to the financial and the sanctions authorities to do it. From Defence's point of view, he's paid in one level his price. He's decimated his own army, and he's ruined the reputation of his army that everyone thought was invincible. Turns out is not very invincible, and turns out that his equipment isn't very good either. So if I was in the business of trying to buy new aerospace equipment around the world, I wouldn't be buying Russian. And we should make sure everyone knows that to do that. So, but look, on the sanctions thing, I certainly think there's a price to be paid, both in accountability and in rebuilding the country of Ukraine.
Boateng.
Secretary of State, you've identified the threat and the challenge presented by Russia and China. The Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst has for many years been a means of projecting not just Britain's global power, but also our values globally through the provision of scholarships. I was at a Trooping of the Colour ceremony in Barbados on holiday over the summer, where it was put to me that there are no longer scholarships provided by the British government for members of Caribbean armed forces who play such an important part, not just in terms of disaster relief, but also in terms of drug interdiction, as I remember from my own time from the Home Office and the Treasury. So what can we do in order to address that? Because joint work with the FCDO is, after all, part and parcel of what you are encouraged by the Treasury to do. So isn't there a case really for restoring those scholarships? Because if we don't provide scholarships, and we don't, we know who is providing them, and they're being taken up.
Well, if that's okay, I'll write to the committee about, they should be, okay? It's that simple. I wish when I was a young cadet, someone had got me and said, this is called soft power, and you be nice to all your guests, because fundamentally they'll remember it. And in 20, 30 years' time, when I see my counterpart from the Qatari Air Force, he trained at RAF Valley flying Jaguars. When I see my counterpart from Oman, he was at Dartmouth doing his Navy education. The Emir of Qatar and his brothers are at Sandhurst. So, all of that is something we should do more of. It's not a dirty word, soft power. It's actually a very, very, and you'll know yourself from your own time, very important part. And when we talk about competing in the world, we should embrace it, not be frightened of doing it. I don't know why we don't do it well enough, if you want my honest opinion. I think some people have lost the skill that it is, but it is really important. And it's why in this command paper, we've increased our defence attaché network significantly. I think another 30 defence attachés. We're professionalising that career structure, investing in their skills and their capabilities. It is a fundamental part of influence and support around the world. It's the soft power, and it must go hand in hand with the hard. I can do my bit in defence. I just think we could do so much more.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State.
I hope you would agree that I might go back to Lord Anderson. If that's okay with you.
China. At the beginning, you said Russia was an adversary, China a competitor. Given China's recent conduct, can we continue to have such a hard and fast differentiation? And are you happy with the degree of China knowledge and experience in your own department, particularly in relation to language? How many Mandarin speakers do you have?
Well, so I could perhaps ask by linking the last question. Soft power is about understanding the cultures and having relationships, whether they are with your rivals or whether they are with your friends. And it's the sort of thing we are not remotely high enough up in our knowledge of China, our SWEP as we'd call it, needs to improve. Whether that is basic language speakers or whether that is long experienced people who spent time in that country, etc. So that is important. We're not good enough, I think is where we are, and we need to invest in that. It is the rising power, and by 2030, we'll only have ourselves to blame if we have not invested in that knowledge, and both intelligence-wise, but also in just effectively engagement with that country. So I think I'd join you in putting the marker down. It's 2022. We've got 8 years. We better get on with it. And I think that is a strong message. On the other side, I forgot the other part of the question there.
Can we continue to label China merely as a competitor?
I think that's a matter for the new IR. Let's see what they do. They do that. I ultimately, whatever you label someone, it might be how it triggers the whole system, but fundamentally, our competition is pretty obvious. We stand for democracy, human rights, freedom of expression, open liberal democracies and economies. And I do remember in those old days where we did used to think communism was wrong. The Soviet Union was as much about ideology as it was about other things, and we somehow seem to have forgotten the ideological debate when it comes to China. And China have been very open. They don't believe in the democratic model. They're not hiding it. So we are competing around the world for ideology, and there's no harm in that. We just seem to have given up. We forgot about it in 1991. So ultimately, that's what's really at stake here.
Thank you.
And Secretary, thank you very much indeed. And you mentioned in your responses the power of soft power. And when other members of the committee visited Bahrain and Qatar, we were in no doubt about that, the respect that was there for the UK armed forces, because they're seen as trustworthy trainers and as being highly expert. And indeed, often our interlocutors were keen to go round the room testing out their officials as to whether they've been to Dartmouth or to Sandhurst. But the serious point of that is, of course, that trust has to be maintained. And you can hear from the strength of view of my colleagues that they wish you well and your department well in maintaining its high reputation, because that is, of course, the essential component of the defence of the United Kingdom. Thank you for your contribution today. Formally close the public meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Very good.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.